Hi, everybody. I'm Rich, Florida. I'm just delighted about our conversation tonight on the challenge of the city. Paul and I, we met, well, we'd known each other, Rob and I had known each other via email. We met about a year ago. We met about a month ago. But we said when we first met we'd like to do a conversation of this nature. And we said the person we'd most like to do it with is Rob Sampson. And then by happenstance, Rob is visiting at NYU. So it's really terrific for all of us that we could do this. This is a partnership of the Marron Institute, which Paul runs, in the NYU School of Continuing and Professional Studies, where I sit here. I'm a global research professor here, and I also hold an appointment at the University of Toronto. These guys are two of the most eminent social scientists in the world. Paul is professor of economics at NYU. He's director of the Urbanization Project, and he's the director of the Marron Institute. And although his work is known in many respects, he's most known for making one of the most fundamental, if not the most fundamental, contribution to growth theory. And Paul, it's incredibly an honor to have you spending your time thinking about cities. Rob is visiting this year at NYU. He's the Henry Ford, the second professor of social sciences at Harvard, a member of the Sociology department, a member of the National Academy of Sciences. He taught at the University of Chicago, and he wrote probably, if not the most important book on cities of the past couple of decades, certainly one of them, The Great American City on Chicago. This is a conversation which I'll just help kick off, and we're all going to guide that conversation among the three of us. We'll talk for 45 minutes, maybe amongst ourselves, maybe a little longer. I'll watch the clock. We have till 6:30. And then we want to invite questions from all of you. I think our preferred mechanism for that is that you write them down, and people come along and collect them, and then we'll discuss them. And we have if anyone is social media friendly, we have a hashtag. It's called City Challenge. So, and really, if you want to tweet about this, by all means, do so. And we'll make the conversation available online. I think we're doing some video, and we'll also probably create a transcript of some sort. I'll start it off. And then, as I said, this should be freewheeling. As an urbanist studying cities, at once we are, amazed by the resurgence of cities, the comeback of cities. We were talking on email and talking about how when I was I guess we all were in high school, the cities were dead. They were bankrupt. And now cities have resurged, but actually this discipline of kind of urbanism, whether economist, sociologist, urban planner like me, has kind of divided into two camps. On the one hand, and I've been accused of being in this camp occasionally, along with people like Ed Glazer or Bruce Katz, they are the urban optimists who believe that cities are back, cities are on the right track, cities are growing, mayors should be ruling the world, Ben Barber's book. But counterposed to that is another camp that has very legitimate and important things to say because I'm reading more of them. And so juxtaposed to this urban optimist camp are kind of, I would call them the urban pessimists. And it's not just academics. It's now a group of kind of celebrities, like David Byrne one day, or Moby another day, writing, gentrification is killing my city. It's no longer innovative. The creative energy is being priced out. The city is no longer what it was. And I just wanted to start, before we get into more academic-heavy subjects, what do you guys, what do we think about this? Is it cause for optimism? Is it cause for pessimism? Or is it something in between?
Well, I'll start. You pointed out that my early work was on growth, and my summary of conversations with people about growth was that everybody's in favor of growth, but nobody wants change. And I think that's part of the tension we've got with cities, that the pessimists right now are not pessimistic about the things they were pessimistic about 20 years ago, about hollowing out, decay, bankruptcy, failure. They're pessimistic about a lot of changes that we're seeing. And I think, just as in the area of growth, we have to get used to the fact that cities are not static things, that they're kind of designed once and then they live forever in that form. They're always changing. And so we'll hear this complaint about change and useful discussion about how to manage change in the most successful way. how to think about how change might impinge on different people, how it might affect inequality. But that's the kind of pessimism you want to have, not the pessimism about decay, decline, failure.
As usual, I'm torn. So the pessimism side, it's actually easy to make that case for many cities. Take New York. I think it's widely considered to be renewed in many respects. It's not just economics. The crime rate is down tremendously. So I lived in New York in late 70s and early 80s. How many people lived here in the early 80s? Yeah, okay. It was another world. Bernie Goetz, there was all kinds of fear. There was out-migration. The violence rate truly was off the charts, as it was in many other cities, Chicago, Los Angeles. And at least in the social science world, that was written about a lot in the sense of the social transformation. My colleague Bill Wilson wrote a famous book, The Truly Disadvantaged, about, you might think of it as the collapse of the city, jobs gone, the out-migration of the middle class. He didn't pay as much attention to crime as I think he should have, but I think that was a piece of it. So in that sense, things are undeniably better. On the other hand, and we might want to talk about this more at some point, I think you really have to look at it in terms of differential trajectories. Detroit, is that healthy and expanding? Well, maybe it's getting a little bit better, but from a really low baseline. St. Louis, Stockton, California. So, yeah, some cities are doing great. It's part of the inequality story. And I think it really depends when and where.
So my take on this is that partly what Paul identified, and partly what Jane Jacobs, if you take Paul's work, married it with Jane's, you get this notion that the clustering of talented people, knowledgeable people, high human capital people creates economic growth, and that creates a sorting. A sorting which is not just what the Chicago school, right, told us, which is lower skill people in the center, higher skill people in the suburb, but a sorter which, to use your words, Rob, is heterogeneous and differentiated. And one of the things you've helped me understand is this idea, because I was always thinking about concentrated prosperity, because I'm myopic, and that's what urban economists and urban planners like me were looking at when in a time of decline. Can you talk just a little bit about how you came to this notion of the persistence of concentrated disadvantage, and maybe, if you will, I don't want this, how it might marry with this idea of concentrated prosperity and this kind of differentiation, persistence, change, and heterogeneity in cities, across cities and suburbs?
Yeah, there's a lot there, but let me see if I can put it in the following way. So a lot of my work focuses on spatial inequality, particularly as it's manifested in neighborhoods and communities. And we can define neighborhoods in many different ways. I tend to think of it as subsections of cities that have spatial differentiation, social distinctiveness, if you will. And the fact is, if you look back over a long period of history, and you look at cities around the world, spatial divisions, spatial differentiation is a fundamental phenomenon. In the United States, which I've studied the most, I think we can think of it as a kind of neighborhood effect. At least that's sort of an academic way of thinking about it. The ways that neighborhoods differentiate themselves and also have effects, I've argued, on a wide span of phenomena over a long period of time. In fact, the subtitle of my book was The Enduring Neighborhood Effect. But let me just throw out sort of three propositions about neighborhoods and neighborhood effects I think may help. One is not that surprising, and that's just the feature of concentration. But it's important to understand just how much many social behaviors are, in fact, concentrated in space. Now, this goes against kind of current common wisdom, right? I mean, the world is flat. Oliver Friedman, he's right about economic trade, I think, in part. But it's wrong to think of the world as flat when it comes to social differentiation. It's very spiky, very much inequality. We just talked about crime. Homicide rates, very much concentrated. In fact, just give you a little statistic, get a feel for it. Criminologists have shown that something like 5% of the street addresses, intersections in cities account for 100% of robberies. I mean, that is unbelievable concentration, right? It's not spread, and therefore we really need to think of concentration effects. And you think of it in terms of poverty and so forth, affluence. So inequality is concentrated. Proposition 2, less appreciated, it's multidimensional. So it's not just poverty and crime, any number of things. At the high end, Richard, you notice talking about affluence. In our work, we've looked at things like teen births. Can look at low birth weight, high school dropout. We even did a letter drop experiment in Chicago where we scattered letters randomly. The rate at which people return, random strangers will return letters, I think of it as kind of an indicator of altruism, ranges from 0% in some neighborhoods to over 82%. Huge variability. The point of the multidimensionality is that disadvantage, I think, I would argue, but also at the upper end, advantage, hyper advantage, cluster together. So you think of it, I think of it as kind of a clustering effect, correlated adversities or correlated advantages. So that's proposition 2 I would throw out there. And 3 is the persistence effect. And this is less, I think, appreciated. Why? Well, I think it's because neighborhoods and cities are constantly changing, right? People are moving in and out all the time. But what I've been interested in a lot is whether the social character, whether the essence of that neighborhood is changing or not. And it turns out that neighborhoods are surprisingly persistent. That is to say, relatively the same. If you're a high poverty neighborhood at one point in time, you tend to become a high poverty neighborhood many years later. Showed that in Chicago. We can talk about gentrification in a bit, but yes, there's change and neighborhoods flip and so on and so forth. But the persistence at both the high end and the low end, right? The Upper East Side of New York is the Upper East Side. The Gold Coast of Chicago, as I've argued, is as golden as ever. These things are persistent. And I would add 2 other points of persistence. One, persistence is a phenomenon across generations. Pat Sharkey, sociologist here at NYU, has showed this at the neighborhood level in terms of intergenerational transmission of neighborhood disadvantage, which really hadn't been appreciated before. It's another form of disadvantage that links across generations. And finally, persistence across historical scales. Archaeologists have shown recently that even if you go back to ancient cities through digs, that there's good evidence of spatial division. What that tells me is that, and what some of the archaeologists have argued, is that this is one of the universals of human life, is sorting, to go back to your point.
In this sort of environment of, I think, reasonable optimism about growth, optimism about the return of the revival of cities, inequality and a trend towards increasing inequality is something that a number of thoughtful people are concerned about. And it is useful to take the dynamics of inequality and then to map it also onto this spatial variation, and then to think about the interaction between space and durability and persistence. Someone, Jerry Holton, who was the president of Poly here at NYU, told me that in the Navy, they had this kind of mythology about what they called the sick ship, where you'd have like one aircraft carrier that was always a problem, another aircraft carrier which would be just fine, physical design exactly the same. And all of the people turned over every 18 months in the sick ship. But yet there was some kind of persistence about norms or culture of complaint, animosity, friction that didn't change. And that seems like kind of a nice extreme that one can use to weigh against, say, persistence in neighborhoods and start to get into this question of what drives that persistence. Is it just persistence of the physical people who are there? Not always. And then if it can be transmitted and is stable even with significant flows in and out, what kinds of things can actually change these neighborhoods? Like we've seen crime change dramatically, at least in absolute levels. Maybe the relative comparisons stay the same, but the level of crime in some of these neighborhoods has changed just remarkably in the last 20 years.
Paul, let me ask you a question that tries to bridge those. And of course, you guys can ask me a question if you want. Yeah. But economists, not you, but economists in generally it's been said that they think aspatially. That economists don't typically take into account city effects, never mind neighborhood effects. But how would you, because I know you've thought about this and already mentioned norms, mores, values, behavior patterns. In a model of growth or in a model of transformation, given your work on this, how would you begin to think or embed these characteristics of neighborhood effects or spatial effects in thinking about this?
Yeah, I think the fundamental issue has to do with their model of human motivation. Because, there's a little bit of urban economics and thinking about land and so forth. But I think what's missing is this understanding that people's notions about right and wrong and other subtle norms are dynamic and strongly influenced by the people that they interact with. And that interaction always takes place through close physical proximity. So physical location matters once you recognize that a norm, like some of these norms in these ships, norms about complaint, animosity, friction, grievance that persists, those things get transmitted from person to person. And it's not the same as the transmission of kind of knowledge that we think of taking place in science. There's another dynamic going on there, and it's that dimension I think economists
And so you're
have
saying
missed.
it's less the physical boundaries, they may or may not play, it's actually the behaviors or the norms or the normative structures that perpetuate across a number of people, whether that's a ship or a physically delimited neighborhood.
Yeah, and that's consistent with a sociological view. I'm glad to see there may be some interdisciplinary possibilities here. So, sociologists would think of that as the social structure, the social interactional patterns that exist, let's say, within a school, within a neighborhood, the norms. So that's the consistency. I think, going to the economists and why don't they think about neighborhoods? I think, first of all, they are more. One of the concerns has been what academics refer to as selection effects, which in a simple way is just, well, how is it that people end up in the neighborhoods that they're in, right? Is it really anything about that? Maybe it's just the fact that you're, selected that neighborhood, you chose that neighborhood. Well, there's been a lot of research on that, and I think we've made some progress. One thing that's important to recognize there, though, is that selection choice is, in a way, at least I've argued, a neighborhood effect in itself, right? Because people are sorting by the characteristics of the neighborhoods, which is sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Economists don't live randomly in any city I've ever been in. And so I think the reputations of neighborhoods and what people think they gain, even if it's status or access to schools, is an important characteristic in our understanding of the sorting and sifting and how you get this sort of persistence over time.
But I actually pursued with Jerry whether there had been any internal research in the Navy, because it struck me that like an aircraft carrier, which is this small, very technical village, would be interesting to study, because you can get things like random assignment there, and so you can set aside any concern about selection and then demonstrate what I think is going on, which is this kind of conformism in norms about behavior and certain kinds of, the big moral questions, but little things, but just what's the right way to treat each other. And those might be interesting kind of laboratories to study this. But the ultimate goal would be to understand how things like selection and, conformist transmission of norms influence the dynamics of these real neighborhoods.
It's funny when you say that. I met the guy who actually has the highest paid speaking business in the country. He's the guy who turned around the ship. I don't know if you've ever seen his speech.
No.
He was in the Navy and he took over one of these 6 ships. So we'll make this happen. He's a really interesting guy. And he took the worst ship, and he's this one instance, and his speech, he gives like 250 speeches a year. But he actually turned around this 6th ship. And Paul, I wanted to ask you one other thing about your recent research with your colleague Brandon Fuller, which I wrote about on Atlantic cities, because I think it's really germane. We're not only talking about this differentiation across US cities. In that paper, you talked about, which was incredibly important, I thought, you talked about we're going to have a world of 8 or 9 billion people, maybe even 10 billion people.
Yeah, probably 10 to 11.
With
total,
most of that growth occurring in the urban centers of the emerging and developing economies. And the point that you guys made that was so fascinating to all of us was that we've gotten used to a pattern of urbanization, well, I'll just summarize, with good governance and reasonable rules, and good political economic capabilities. What we're going to have is urbanization with not great governance, terribly problematic institutions, limited capabilities. And I'd just like you to broaden our conversation for a moment into talking about how you, and some of your ideas for creating better rules or better governance capabilities.
Well, it gets back to some of these questions about persistence. And one of the things we see is that certain aspects of physical space, like the road network, once established, is unlikely to ever change. And so in places where you're expanding the built area of cities, either new cities or expansion of cities, there's a chance to get something like that right. And it might be particularly urgent to get that right relative to something like building codes. You know, the building codes could be brought in later. Buildings turn over time. They get torn down, they get replaced. But you know, the road network in Lower Manhattan is pretty much the way it was when people decided, gee, we should have better road network, and then they put the grid on the parts of the city north of Houston Street. And that kind of very forward thinking about, let's decide what the public space is that's going to let people interact. You know, it's 1811, we don't even know what they're going to use these roads for in 200 years, but let's set those aside. So that's something which can be done, which is very important, very durable, and also doesn't put unrealistic demands on the capacity for governance in some of these cities. And I think a flip side of that is we often, when you think about the pessimistic strains about cities, it's easy to look at a place like Lagos or Mumbai and say, wow, what would it ever take to make things better there? So how do you turn around the ship in a place like that? I think that discussion is misplaced, because it takes a strength of government. You think about, like, you know, Haussmann, who's going to like remake Paris. You know, only incredibly strong and effective governments can do something like that. And where government could do something at the margin that could have a huge effect in what the world looks like in 100 years, is in influencing the development of these new areas.
I think of 2 points of literature there. I think of the really important effect that Sam Bass-Warner's studies had on his studies of Boston and Philadelphia, where he showed that it was early infrastructure, and in his case, a street layout and transit layout that structured all sorts of behaviors, both positive and negative. And there's a civil engineer at the University of Toronto named Chris Kennedy, who has looked at the role of broad, and we'll come back to infrastructure later, but he suggested that the only time you get trajectory changes is when there's a massive crisis, like the London fire, the Great Fire in London. Yep. Changes the layout of the city and creates a new growth trajectory. But other than that, it's not only the clustering of humans and human behaviors, there is this other dimension of the city, which is its physical, not so, maybe it's buildings, but what you're saying, the grid, its street layouts, its circulatory system, if you will.
It's the public space.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. I think the international perspective here is really important. You can also think of it in the social world as well, in terms of laws and ways in which neighborhood inequality is government induced. So in the United States, I think the neighborhood effects literature maybe has been a little bit too much insular, in the sense of that it hasn't accounted as much as it should for state policies, because metropolitan areas differ in terms of suburban city boundaries, the sort of hard boundaries. School districts, Charlotte, North Carolina, for example, is very different than, let's say, the Boston metropolitan area or New York, in terms of how integration can work across the city-suburban lines. And if you look at other cities around the world, I've been involved in some cross-national comparative research, particularly in Stockholm, and that's an interesting comparison, because, wow, it's hard to think of, a country that's much different than the United States. I mean, it's sort of a welfare state. It has very different history. The ethnic heterogeneity is not the same. And yet, you see this kind of spatial division, as you do in the United States, but there are differences. So in Stockholm, for example, the crime rate is much lower. It goes up with concentration of poverty, but it's always below the Chicago, so there's this sort of state effect. But what's interesting and relevant to this conversation is that the distribution just ends at Stockholm and keeps going, ends in Stockholm, keeps going in Chicago. What I mean by that is the concentration of these adversities or disadvantages like poverty, unemployment, and so forth, concentration of space goes up to very high levels that are not seen in Stockholm. And at the other end, you see concentration of affluence, goes back to one of your earlier points, right? It's like the Upper East Side phenomenon, let's call it that. You don't see that in the same way. Now, I think of it as the compression of inequality. That is to say, there are neighborhood differences, but they're compressed, and that's due to, quote, state or government policy. So it's not even just the physical infrastructure. I mean, it has to do, in the United States, I mean, we could talk about this for a while, right? But I mean, it has to do with mortgages, has to do with code enforcement, and there's our legacy of racial inequality. In Sweden, more planned communities and so forth. So I think we really need to take both of these into account.
But, well, you know, we got focused on the grid and the public space just because it was so durable and because it seemed so essential for the functioning of cities, which are about interaction. There is this recent work that Raj Chetty and other people are doing, just looking here in the United States, which suggests that the mobility through space and access to things like jobs may actually be related to income mobility and many other forms of mobility. So it could turn out that this effective allocation of physical space for mobility may actually avoid some of the extremes of isolation, concentration, and
What's interesting,
stasis.
we used to have this differentiation, city and suburb. And if you go back to the Chicago School or even Hoover and Vernon, there's this whole idea about flight from density, right? Rich people moving out at the periphery, away from pollution, away from pathology. And it's interesting, then you get to the point where we get Alan Ehrenholt, and it's the great inversion, and everybody coming, but it's not. The fact of the coming back to the city is like a 4-city story, 5-city story. New York, Boston, Washington, San Francisco, maybe 6. But what we have is this metropolis, which is a polyglot, or it's fractal. I don't have the right words for it. It's concentrated prosperity, concentrated affluence on the Upper East Side, in Greenwich, poverty in the middle. And one of the hypotheses is that what's happening in a big metropolis is that these legacy public goods like transit, which are very scarce, become very valuable. So getting near either close to the city center or close to a transit node, and that's a very scarce good, becomes very valuable and shapes a new kind of city or metropolis, which doesn't look like the old donut or nuclei pattern.
Yeah, you absolutely see that in terms of transportation centers. I mean, we do need to reject what's wrong with the old model. So it's clearly the Chicago school model, concentric zones, and the idea of moving slowly out to the quote suburbs is the ideal working men's homes, as they were called. I mean, that's sort of all gone. On the other hand, you do see pockets of poverty still. Now, they may not be in the inner city.
You're right.
And in fact, I think that lexicon, which we hear it all the time, inner city poverty needs to be discarded because there's lots of outer city poverty. And in fact, the inner city is very attractive in many cities around the world. I mean, it's not just New York, in Chicago, in the Loop, in Boston, and so forth. So, yes, we need to redo our models. And in fact, a little interesting thing that has flown under the radar a bit, if you look at the increases in poverty in the last 10 years or since the Great Recession, it's been greater in suburbs, right? Not in cities.
Amazing.
Greater in suburbs. In Chicago, for example, some of the south suburbs are seeing increases in poverty, and Long Island and so forth. So we really need to rethink our model of the city. Now, Aaron Halt's book, The Great Inversion, is very interesting because he basically says it's kind of being turned inside out. We're becoming more like Paris. Center City is the elite area. I tend to think of it as, rather than inversion, I think of it as a revision, because there is this persistence in the areas that are doing better. For the most part, you could have predicted it.
Yes.
And there's a few outliers off diagonals, and I think I can explain some of those.
And I think
But
it's
we don't
I
wanna
think there's
go
a
overboard.
size effect. I think you don't get this in small metros. You have to be big enough so the pressure to come back from transit and ability gets around. So in a metro over 6 million or 10 million or 20 million is very different. And you said it, Detroit and Cleveland are very different than New York and San Francisco.
Yeah, and we also are not paying attention to the smaller cities. I grew up in Utica, New York. Yeah, I know.
Good beer.
Yeah. By the way,
Well, yeah, the brewery is great, but the downtown is still vacant.
Yeah. One trend that we might see that's related to this power of clustering and diversity is that the biggest cities may have a relative advantage compared to the mid-sized one. And if that's right, to some extent, we may want to accommodate that rather than just resist it. But it's going to be another process of change that's going to be somewhat difficult
And I think
to
the
manage.
returns to size become so substantial. The returns to size and diversity become so, that spiky construct. And no longer is it a national context. You now blow that out to the world, which means the smaller and smaller metros and cities have a more difficult time. Do you guys think, I mean, we've danced around this, and I don't know where I come out. Do you guys think the words city and suburb, urban and suburban, still make sense? Or is that something we have to think about?
Well, I'll give you the empirical evidence, which is I hardly ever use suburb or that dichotomy, city suburbs. So I just don't find it a very fruitful.
Nor do I. I'm sort of, nor do I.
I think it's problematic, and there's some interesting writing on this. Manuel Castells wrote about this, and sort of, if you think about it as urbanization, the world is becoming urbanized, so therefore the idea of urban, non-urban doesn't really make sense. So I kind of agree with Castells, and he was talking about it in terms of, does urban sociology even make sense as a discipline? But to disagree a little bit, city-suburb makes a difference when there's hard boundaries. I mean, when the school district changes from a shitty school to a great school across the line, then the legal distinction, which is embodied in that distinction, does make sense. Now, of course, that's artificial in the sense of where it's laid down, so it's not inherent, but nonetheless, those boundaries do make a difference. So we don't want to toss that out.
And not to get too social science-y, but I think, at least what I tell my research group, is a big part of the problem that people use Metro because there was 365 cases for which there were comparable data, and you could do these and cross-sectional and time series comparisons of metros, but that doesn't. A metro is not a really good unit. It's good for some things, but trying to.
It depends. For example, contrasting the city of Detroit with the Detroit metropolitan area is actually very helpful for teasing out what's going on there. I mean, this is not a Detroit metro phenomenon. And if it was just the auto shock, that should have hit the whole metro area. But it's exactly what you're describing.
Yeah, you go down the road. Border. What is it in Detroit that divides?
8 Mile? Woodward? 8 miles of division.
I don't know Detroit. Yeah, it's just incredible.
Woodward's the one that goes out. Yeah. Well, if you go to Ann Arbor has characteristics that make it look more like Boston or San Francisco. Yes. But I was trying to get at this notion, is neighborhood the right building block? How do you move from neighborhood to city in terms of analysis?
It depends on what question you're asking, because if it's something like a city service, like policing, that's going to start, or schools, that's just going to change very discreetly across a boundary. If you look at patterns of social interaction, that's going to be partly neighborhood-based, but partly based on things that happen in workplaces as well. So there's lots of different scales here, and
but it's really important to bring them together, right? Because I mean, you can live in a poor neighborhood in a metropolitan area that's made up of a mainly working class, middle class, or less inequality, versus living in, let's say, a metropolitan area where it's all concentrated, or mostly concentrated, poverty. And so the spatial inequality dimension has multiple levels. So you really need to take the metro into account. And in fact, going back to the Chetty study, which is interesting on the mobility, what I found interesting about that was that it's really a combination of things, right? They were looking at mobility intergenerationally, so the odds of a child moving up, let's say, from the lower quintile to the upper quintile, was dependent on a number of factors. But one was related to as Paul noted, the income inequality and racial segregation of the metropolitan area. But that's defined by the way that the neighborhoods within that metropolitan area are sorted. That is to say, if you grow up in an area where there's lots of segregated neighborhoods, lots of inequality, then there's lower mobility. Now,
and there's this bidirectional causality, because a place like Atlanta, you have these very separated neighborhoods that aren't well integrated together through things like mass transit. So the lack of connection can make the social dynamics worse. But that lack of connection probably reflects a political dynamic where people were trying to maintain the separations.
And you can't forget the political, right? Because most cities where these things came about are not random. I mean, again, going back to Chicago, where the freeways went, the location of housing projects, which were cited deliberately in low-income black neighborhoods on purpose. So a large part of the concentration of disadvantage was state-induced. I mean, it's not to
By the way, I have to say,
make a conspiracy here.
as an economist, it's such a relief to see somebody from another discipline who has to apologize about the Chicago school. I'm glad I'm not alone in this.
Yeah.
So, Rob, I just wanted to pick up on something that you haven't published yet, but I've read, and there's no more contentious issue than gentrification in urban affairs that I can think of. I mean, New York just elected a mayor based not entirely, but largely on that issue, and it's something that percolates through urbanisms and conversations about cities. You've done a pretty darn hard look at this question, and I know people haven't a few of us have gotten to read it. It comes out sometime this summer. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what you've been finding because this is an empirical question, not just an advocacy question, what you've been finding as you've dug into this question of gentrification.
Right. Well, first of all, I'll agree with you. It's very controversial. I think we went through 10 reviewers, some of whom were screaming at us. Well, first of all, what is gentrification? That's a problem, because it turns out that it's hard to get a definition. People define it different ways. It's a bad thing, it's a good thing. We tried to define it in terms of a process whereby neighborhoods that were formerly disinvested are subjected to upgrading, renewal, and replacement, in part, in migration of middle-class population. But how do you measure it? Well, it turns out that it's been really hard to do, and we tried to get at that through new ways, including observation, and we even used Google Street View to identify specific neighborhoods that have demonstrated aspects of upgrading. And we looked at the trajectory over about a 20-year period based on a classic study of gentrification. And long story short, yes, gentrification, you can see it starting to increase, but it follows, and you might not be surprised given my earlier thesis, that it really follows a pattern of social inequality and stratification in a very persistent way. So in other words, the racial inequality, and again, this is in Chicago, but the neighborhoods that tend to be gentrified and that have a faster pace of gentrification tend to be the areas that are a little bit more white, that is to say, the lower income neighborhoods that are at risk for gentrification. So you have disinvested neighborhoods, include African American neighborhoods, Latino neighborhoods, and kind of working class, low income white neighborhoods. It turns out that there's kind of a non-linear effective racial composition, so that I guess the way I would put it is that what we observe is that gentrification or gentrifiers appear to desire diversity up to a point, and then gentrification drops off, so predominantly minority neighborhoods are not gentrified. And that goes with Latino as well. Now, that's Chicago, and I know that some neighborhoods, like in New York, are flipping.
Isn't this like the flip side of the same thing you observed with flight from crime?
Yeah, and that's the interesting thing. If you do like the classic Schelling model of tipping, it is kind of the reverse. And what it does, though, is tell you that the gentrification theorists are right at some level in the sense of diversity and tolerance, that people seek that. But behaviorally, I think what it's telling us is that there's limits in terms of what people are actually buying into in terms of the actual gentrification trajectories.
But it's striking that both this bad phenomenon, like an increase in the rate of crime, and this good phenomenon, that sort of the revival of cities, can both reinforce inequality in a sense that the worst neighborhoods both get hit
paradox.
Hardest with the bad thing and don't get the
well,
good.
It's the best of times, worst of times, right? So things are getting better, but on the other hand, there's a reproduction of inequality that's going on. But the other thing, again, I'm going to flip back to the optimistic side, is the crime rate has come down, and even the neighborhoods that are still the, quote, worst off, the highest poverty, their rates are much less than they were 20 years ago. So they're better off in many respects.
Let me pick up on that one, because I think it's a really surprising development for everybody who's thought about these questions. And this pattern of kind of persistence of norms or culture or behaviors tends to make us very pessimistic about change in an existing neighborhood. But yet crime is just a counterexample to any claim that things can't change. It's changed dramatically in a short period of time.
And just when I was becoming pessimistic, I happened to meet you and Professor Sharkey, who started to teach me about the crime decline. And I'd come to your guys' work seeing you had really unpack this issue of concentrated disadvantage. Kind of eye-opening for me. But then I hear you and Pat saying, no, that you are more optimistic, just want to build on, because of this crime decline. And in fact, it bodes it bodes better things for the future of cities than one might have imagined. So I just wanted to pick up, how do you see that?
Well, yes, I think it does make me somewhat optimistic. Again, if you go back to the quote, bad old days, the story of the collapse of the inner city is often written about, again, in terms of economic collapse and the factories, and loss of jobs and so forth. But I believe that violence played a crucial role in the unraveling of many cities, and there's good empirical evidence on this. So I'm not going to get into the specifics, but a lot of research has shown.
The causality there could well be that a lot of the jobs moved because of the
And that too,
crime.
right. So it was kind of a reciprocal
I think that's
effect. But violent crime, I think there's good evidence that suggests that it was a major player in the outmigration of many, including black middle class, from the city. And that went on for a long period of time. And then about mid-90s, as scientists, criminologists, sociologists, we were caught off guard, I'll be honest. We didn't know. It's kind of like political scientists, right, are often criticized for, collapse of the Soviet Union. Why didn't you predict it?
Economists with the financial crisis.
Yeah. So here we are. We couldn't predict the crime decline. We didn't see it coming, and it started in about 1993, 94, 95, depends on the city, and shot down. And this is a real phenomenon. Some people say, oh, the police hide the statistics. No, it's real. It's down. It's huge. It's in all groups, minority communities, you name it, across the board. We are at levels now, and basically, I mentioned to you in an email, in the 1950s, right? The old shows, Leave It to Beaver, whatever. That's where we're at in terms of crime. It's not the U.S. just. Canada, Toronto is at a 4-decade low rate of crime.
Except for the mayor.
Well, yeah, he's got his own, own little crime wave. And it depends on what
Cluster,
kind of
hotspot.
crime, yeah. Japan's down, Western Europe's down. So that tells me that there's a really fundamental feature in societies going on. We don't fully understand it. I have my set of suspects. But cities, and I mentioned it again, if you take New York as an example, and again, going back to my personal example, when I did live here, I think 6 personal victimizations I had in a very short period of time, including a guy pulling a machete on the subway and one junkie pulling a knife on me in a store. That was common.
It's clear to me. I mean, I was born in Newark, and so I was born in 1957, so I remember some of this pretty well. And my dad worked in Newark. My parents lived in Newark. The people who didn't want to leave the Italian ghetto, they didn't. They wanted to stay in the Italian ghetto. Grandma was closed, Aunt Lil was closed, Aunt Rose was closed, Aunt Maria was closed. They all wanted to stay there, and it was crime and the perception of increasing crime and violence and those incidents.
Right.
And my dad reverse commuted, right? Kind of in a Bill Wilsonian world, reverse commuted to his job in the factory in Newark from our little working class suburb in North Arlington. But it was clearly that perception of violence, and I think that motivated this flight from density.
And even though the trend is very clear and very broad, and we have to understand it, there's still very important variation across locations. And
Absolutely.
so people are still leaving Detroit because of crime, and people are leaving Puerto Rico now because of crime. And both of these are going to face this kind of combined fiscal and governance crisis if they don't address the crime problem.
It's a really important point, Paul. That's what I was saying earlier. Differential trajectories, we have to bear that in mind. Also, what goes down can go back up. It's not inevitable. I mean, the crime rate increased in the 60s, from a very low base, and in the 20s, if you look at it across long historical time, the two big increases were in basically 20s and in the 60s, 70s, and then the decline. Although if you look at it from a longer historical view, urbanization is basically related to lower violence if you're going back to about 1850 down.
Yeah.
So we're becoming more peaceful, believe it or not.
We were joking before about, is there anything left for criminologists to study? I mean, there sure as heck is, because once we start grappling seriously with the decline, we really have to take seriously the increase. And I think also take seriously, what assurance do we have that we're not going to see that again? That there were many things about the 50s and 60s which you'd think were pretty good trends, and then we had this really just incredibly damaging social trend that was coincident with that. And we still don't, I think, have not only do we have a clear sense of why it's come down, but we haven't matched that with a comparable, unified explanation for why it went
And
up.
also, I think there's also this emphasis on violence and again, cities, but sort of an example of it's becoming more widely known now. But if you get outside of the cities and even in rural areas now, there's a real heroin epidemic going on, and then you start to link in things like domestic violence and drug distribution and the unraveling of neighborhoods. It's a little bit off the topic with regard to the major news, but that's something that's going on. So I agree.
So Zimmering claims that
something to do.
drug use is not really down significantly here in New York City, and so that the decline in crime can't be just linked one-to-one to something like a drug epidemic. Does that strike you as
Yeah, well, it depends
plausible?
on which drug.
Yeah.
But I think the crack cocaine epidemic was clearly linked to the thing is, it's the violence trade linked to certain distribution of certain types of drugs.
But it's interesting, Paul, something that we both care about, we've talked about, the movement of jobs in downtown Detroit. If you look at what Dan Gilbert is doing, a lot of what he's doing, he's made a decision to site the company there. He decided that it was much more cost effective to get people there, but a lot of what he's doing is trying to create crime mitigation.
Yeah.
He has a state-of-the-art basement there with all of his monitors to try and there was a big commitment to different kind of policing strategies and private investment. So I think you're right, in different cities where crime has not, that's the other thing that you've talked about. In some cities, crime has gone way down, like New York, but in Detroit, it's gone down a little. Newark, it's gone down maybe a little. New Orleans, maybe just a bit. But it's nowhere near the story.
And still much higher than our peers, if you will, in Western democratic
There was
nations.
a New York Times story recently about Puerto Rico where what the people were saying to the reporters is, yeah, the schools got worse. I moved my kids into private school. I took a second job, but then once the crime started getting worse, we left. And that it's very clear that crime is the thing that will drive people away from a city and can get it into one of these downward spirals that is got to be broken. But then you got to look at where thinking about crime is going, and there is this high-tech panopticon kind of view that that's the solution to crime. But the evidence actually suggests to the contrary. It's really the relationship between the community and the individual police officers, and this is what Detroit's got to get a handle on, and they're trying.
And they
to.
don't have the density. They don't have the tightly knit neighborhoods. They're trying to they don't have kind of the Jane Jacobs eyes on the street effect, and they also haven't had a lot of immigration, which has changed crime. I can see people wanting to get ready for questions, but we have one other topic that I just want to push us to before we take questions, and that is kind of, I'm an urban planner, economic geography, you're an economist, a sociologist, and how do we think social science can best attack this? I was hooked as a kid because I took a course in urban geography at Rutgers. They made me walk around Lower Manhattan, and it was part economics, and it was part political science, and it was part history, and it was multidisciplinary, and I couldn't focus on any one of them. And I loved it because it could bring all these things. How do we think, either from our disciplinary perspectives or from a multidisciplinary perspective, and then one other layer, this whole thing about big data, right? NYU's made a big push with the CUSP and others, this big data. How do you think the city and social science and big data, how do we think we can make sense, and where can social science add the most value to our understanding of the city?
I mean, I'll jump in if you want. I'm worried that there's a real disconnect between the academic mechanisms of research and publication and the actual processes that create learning organizations, like collections of people where they collectively figure out how to do things better. And there's a kind of a grounding in physical practice that the academic perspective, I think, often loses. There's a kind of a narrowness of the single hypothesis in the statistical test. And I think, in particular in crime, the innovations in policing practices, I mean, it's a debate how important policing practices have been, but we know that police matter, and we know that there's some things they do that don't matter. So it has to be the case that there's some things they do that do matter.
Yep.
And then if you get them to do more of the things that matter versus the things that don't matter, that's got to be a good thing too. So I think policing practices have got to be a part of this discussion. And none of the improvements in policing practices have come from, I think, the traditional, tell me if you think I'm wrong, but that from the traditional academic disciplines.
I remember your former colleague at Stanford, Nate Rosenberg, his incredible work on where does technological advance come from. And he said, you know, we have this model that it starts out in a lab, and occasionally it does, but most of the time it comes from people tinkering around in a factory or in a shop. And one of the things I know you've been thinking long and hard is what you call Pasteurs Quadrant. And I think people would like to, I mean, I think that's a really interesting way to frame our thinking about the city. It's not all highfalutin theory. There's a Pasteurs Quadrant where practice and theory, reality and thinking come together.
There was a political scientist named Don Stokes who described different styles of research. And he described one style as the Edison style, where you're solving problems, but it's really very context specific. Another is the Bohr style, which is driven mostly by curiosity, but takes advantage of abstraction. And he identified Pasteur's work. So when Pasteur was trying to improve food preservation techniques, he was trying to address very specific practical problems, but yet was willing to use the methods of abstraction to help develop, say, microbiology as a new line of inquiry in biology. So I think what we need is a little bit less Bohr science in thinking about cities or any complicated social phenomenon, and a lot more Pasteur-like work where we're pretty grounded in specific problems and aware of what people solving those problems are doing, and go out to kind of learn about what they know rather than to tell them what we think we know.
Let me just build on that a little bit with regard to your general question about big data. I think what's happening now, there's sort of an emergence of what some would call kind of a new science of the city. And I'm impressed by the extent to which much of this is interdisciplinary. Been in a couple meetings. One was at Santa Fe Institute, where you had physicists talking with computational scientists, with sociologists, with political scientists. You know, I'd never seen that in my career before. I think that's promising. How, you know, what will happen, I don't know. But I think there's a sense in which this is a very interdisciplinary phenomenon, that you start with questions rather than disciplines. That's good. I think there's been way too much hype of big data. I think the editor of Wired magazine said, well, you know, big data, we don't, you know, theory is useless because the data will tell us everything. Data don't speak for themselves. One of the problems with so-called big data, whether it's, you know, Twitter or the streams of data that are coming into cities, is that it's sort of, there's this information that's being emitted, but we don't necessarily know what it means. And so one of the things that we've tried to do in my research shop at Harvard, we have a initiative, Boston Area Research Initiative. In part, what it's trying to do is to work with the city, and Menino set up what's called the Office of the New Urban Mechanics, and this ties exactly into what Paul was saying, is that Menino wanted to run a city, right? It's a very practical thing, and they're getting all this data. Data are interesting scientifically, but they're also interesting with regard to how it can improve governance. And so the science part was, well, we were trying to figure out, how do you take these data and create a meaningful set of metrics and measures, what we call ecometrics. It's a little bit jargon, but I think it's useful, sort of a metric for the study of ecology. And we think of it as the ecometrics for big data, and we created indicators, problem properties, crime, hotspots, you know, right down to things like rodent infestations in particular areas that are very practical, but they also feed into theories about urban disorder and crime. And we're working with the city, and I'd like to think of this as kind of a new model. In fact, we had a conference called Reimagining the City-University Connection. So that's the vision anyway, is that we'll contribute to science, but we will also contribute to a practical sort of governance-linked aspect of the city, which is crucially important.
I think there's this other question about inductive versus deductive that I'd like to just pick up. You know, and I got this from two people. I got very close to Herb Simon when I taught at Carnegie Mellon, who consistently told me we have to do more inductive stuff. And I became very close to Jane Jacobs in Toronto, who was almost completely inductive, inductive and intuitive. And my colleagues, many of them don't like this at all. And when I do it, they think I'm full of BS. But I'll tell you what I've come to conclude, and I read a lot of theory. Almost any new idea I've ever had came from observing something that didn't make sense conceptually. Now, I don't know how many I probably didn't have any new ideas, but it came from an induction that I've then had to go back to theory. And I wonder how you guys view that. Am I like unique in that the observation of the real world helps me reframe problems? Is there a necessary relationship between inductive and deductive in thinking about the city? Or is one better than the other?
I mean, my take is that pure theory can be very valuable. So I'm not one who knocks theory or, say, the use of mathematics and economics. But I think it starts with a grounded question and a process of induction. And so kind of a case we can emulate and think of as being canonical is something like people invent steam engines, then physicists develop thermodynamics to figure out what's going on. Once you've got thermodynamics, you see a bunch of things you didn't see before, and it's very valuable. But it wasn't that thermodynamics led to the development of the steam engines. On the contrary, it was the steam engines that really revolutionized the approach within physics.
Yeah, I think you need both. I always think of my work as having a conversation between theory and data. I'm with you, Richard. I mean, in terms of the observations are critically important. On the other hand, just correlations within data, again, don't necessarily tell us what's going on. I mean, if we take the phenomenon we're talking about today, like the correlation of lots of different things together, you can do an analysis and see things clustering, but it doesn't tell us why. And the causal mechanisms really require us to think conceptually. And also, again, I would go to the prior point, which is what are data? I mean, data are theory is one way of thinking about it. That is to say, what you subject in the first place to even study or observe, or why do we see some things and not others? That requires a certain set of reflections, which in part is linked to theory. By the way, this debate goes on even in sociology within non-quantitative work. Ethnographers are fighting over whether or not you should do only kind of inductive observation work versus theory-driven qualitative work. So it's not just a quantitative thing. This is a kind of an interesting debate in the social sciences writ large.
I guess we should go to the questions, and I'll just put two together. And there's more I could, but I'll try. And this set of questions says, what are our thoughts on displacement? Right? A very good question. And then the related question is, we agree that economic growth is good, right? I think this person is saying we're better off being New York or San Francisco than Newark, my hometown, or Detroit. You have more resources to solve problems. Then is inequality the problem, or is affordability the problem? So this question of displacement, and then this question of in a growth environment, is the problem inequality or affordability? And I see them as a nested set of questions.
Yeah. I think that the low-hanging fruit is to watch for things where policy is making displacement worse or inequality worse. So affordability traces back to things like supply. And we have to be analytical and hard-nosed about supply versus demand and how you reconcile those. If there's a big increase in demand in one location, how do you either adjust the supply or let the price go up to adjust who gets there or to randomize? So I think that we want to avoid a number of things that we've done in the past which treat symptoms and actually can make the underlying problems worse. I think the more interesting question is, to what extent can we intervene? And another low-hanging fruit might be good mobility, good transit, good road networks. That's good on a whole bunch of dimensions. The trickier things are where you might use policy to force an outcome that wouldn't happen through just decentralized interaction, like some kind of policy that encourages more integration. If more integration helps change this dynamic of these sort of subtle issues about norms and culture and things that we don't understand very well. I think it needs to be an important part of the conversation amongst economists who don't think very much about things like norms, to ask whether this gives us a particularly important area for trying to increase patterns of both mobility, interaction, integration, whatever you call it. I think those are the deeper things to address, and then at the same time recognize that, like I said about growth and change, there will be change inevitably as this process plays out, and we can't reflexively get stuck in this position of just trying to resist change.
Yeah, several things, kind of building off what you're saying, Paul. I mean, in any urban environment, yeah, change is inevitable. And people are always moving out, right? And so the problem with displacement is it's hard. The definition is a bit
It's like
fuzzy,
gentrification.
right? Just like gentrification. Well, what do we actually mean
gentrification.
by displacement? If someone moves, are they being displaced? Or is it involuntary or voluntary? Every time someone moves, it doesn't necessarily mean it's involuntary. So, in other words, if you look at, and surveys have done this, you ask people about where they're living, how long they intend to stay in their neighborhood, whether they like their neighborhood. There's a lot of heterogeneity. Some people hate where they live, can't wait to get out. Will seek any aspect or opportunity to get out. So there's heterogeneity. There's renter, homeowner. There was a study done, many studies actually have done, of gentrification, particularly among older people who have homes that, because they don't have the means to keep it up, have been falling apart, where developers have bought the properties and they actually made a profit and were able to escape neighborhoods they wanted to get out of. So in a sense, the gentrification was, quote, good. Other times people want to stay and it's, quote, bad. We really have to take all these into account. But I think gentrification research has been pretty weak on this. And let's not forget that the government also plays a role, not just developers. I mean, they obviously set zoning regulations and so forth. But in some communities, like in New Jersey, an interesting exposure to this at Strauss Institute, where I'm at this semester, in Mount Holly, where the government basically just decided that a poor neighborhood, by the way, it was the only poor neighborhood in Mount Holly, was derelict and had so run down that they needed to apply eminent domain, buy up the property, give people money, and then they were going to redevelop it. But the problem was that the new development would be so expensive that the people that lived there could not afford to live there. In effect, that's saying goodbye, poor people, to this community. That's real displacement. So I think there's a real variability here in terms of what we mean. And I kind of agree that affordability and policies that allow the lower income and working class to live in communities that they want to live in, that's what we really should be focusing in on, and not assume that any move is displacement.
So I'm enough of a Romarian, enough of Marxist, and enough of a Schumpeterian to say that growth, generally speaking, is good. And what I think, though, we're going through is a structural shift in our growth model. And that's creating the conjoint inequality and affordability problem. So the growth model that we had was one that was based on everything I studied. Big, vertically integrated, economy of scale, producing giant corporations. But that had a physical manifestation called the American suburb. And I was talking to a colleague, Steve Cohen, today from Berkeley, and he said, Ike figured this out. We give everybody a house, a car, and a factory job. And we build a bunch of highways so that growth model could solve the workforce problem because it could push up working class wages, and then make affordability by creating decentralization. The problem is that growth model broke or changed. I don't want to say it broke, it changed for all the reasons Paul Romer taught us. We moved to knowledge, endogeneity, the integration of science, technology, human capital, and the other thing declined or we offshored it, and we don't have a functional growth model. So what do we have? We have a bifurcation of the labor market, complete bifurcation, where there's incredible returns to skills, and where do those skills cluster? Big metropolitan areas and dense city centers. The physical skills are all the stuff on the outside. At the same time, we have incredible demand. So we have growing inequality and incredible demand for a scarce supply of housing units, right? A bunch of people have told us about this. A scarce supply of housing units, either in the center or near transit. And what do? Our policy mechanisms are still legacy, almost all biased towards the old. So my hunch is we can't solve the affordability problem without at least addressing the inequality problem. There has to be a way of elevating the bottom, not just trying to make housing more affordable at the margin. And you can't do that without everything Paul and Rob just said about transit, public goods. So it's a conjoint. And let me just, when I hear our macroeconomists, and Paul, I'd love to hear your perspective on this, like Larry Summers, who I admire, say, my God, we have a demand problem in this freaking country. You know, we don't have enough demand, that it's not monetary policy, and we have to build infrastructure. And I want to just smash the table and say, it's not just building infrastructure, it's city build. It's what Paul Romer and Rob Sampson are saying. It's about city building and the building of a new growth model. So I think somehow it's not just all of these questions: inequality, affordability, displacement, job bifurcation, economic polarization, are all nested.
Yeah. So, well, one thing at this level, we really do have to bring back in the global dimension to this. And so, to people like Larry who are worried about insufficient investment demand in the rich world, urbanization in the developing world just going to solve the worldwide shortage of investment demand if we can figure out how to arrange the intermediation. But more important for this conversation, technology may be part of why we're seeing this widening inequality in the rich countries. But there's also this development around the world, which is that we're seeing a reduction in inequality between countries and then an increase in inequality within countries. Right. And this really is part of this process of global integration, which in some sense is a natural thing. It's the result of removing barriers and connecting. But that still doesn't mean that we should just passively watch the increase in inequality in the US that's coming from this. We shouldn't try and go back to autarky and stop trading with the world. But there may be reasons why the right kinds of policies that focus on mobility in all these different dimensions and interaction in all these different dimensions would be not just humane things to do, but actually efficiency enhancing for the whole system. And that's really, I think, where the debate and your work, Chetty's work, I think all this work is trying to go about how do we bring back all of those different dimensions of mobility, not in the sense of accepting transfers that reduce inequality but slow growth, but really to enhance the kind of growth process we want, but then still accepting that this really profound integration that we're going on throughout the world is going to mean that high wage manual factory job is just a thing of the past.
This question relates to that, and I just want to get it in there. It's about the US. What about the smaller cities? The Flint, Michigans, the Stockton, Californias, the Mobiles, but I would push that out to a global level. What about, London? I always say the world is flat if you're in London, New York, San Francisco, Paris, Tokyo, and Shanghai. But if you're in the second and third tier, fourth tier cities in those places, the world is not very flat at all. It's very uneven. So I would just like, what about, as we go through this process of integration, it is very spatially articulated. Certain places are doing considerably better than others, and it may be across countries, but other places are having a much harder time. How do we begin to think about those second, third, fourth tier cities, not only in the United States, but around the world? That's, I think, the spirit of that question.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely right. And I think, at least in the US, as I noted earlier, a lot of these cities are just kind of not thought about very much. They're sort of off the map, but they're really important. A lot of people live there once you aggregate all the populations. And what you're seeing is, especially in the middle part of the country, right, is a real deep population. In fact, some states, Nebraska, Iowa, and others, I mean, you see governors advertising for people to come to their communities. Towns are falling apart, and as I was saying, drug use and other things. A lot of the, quote, pathologies that were formerly attached to the inner city we're seeing in these rural areas. So they're very much, I think, part of the story. And how to solve that problem is a deep one. I mean, one of the things that's saving some of the cities in Nebraska and some of the other small towns is immigration. Yep. So the factories, the only growth that's come in places like St. Joseph's, I think it is, in Minnesota. I mean, there was a book just written on this, and other places, is through immigration. And so now there's sort of a sense in which, even though the politics are such that historically the middle part of the country was, sort of, quote, conservative, there's now a real, I think, sea change going on to rebuild the populations. But they're still struggling, like you say, and the inequality is there. And what's happening is that the inequality in the United States is really increasing. And you all know this. I mean, it's kind of the coastal phenomenon, right? Where on the coast, there's a lot of demand in terms of people that are well off to move there, which, by the way, I just want to make sure we get on the table the fact that a lot of the analysis and talk about inequality, I think we really need to make sure we separate the relative piece of it from absolute deprivation. I think there's been a little bit of a loss of
absolutely right.
talking about absolute deprivation, right? Because a
absolutely
lot of the
right.
inequality is being driven by the high end, the tails of the distribution.
Yeah, there's
And
more,
a lot
more
of-
differentiation in the 1%.
Exactly, and this goes, so now I'm going to flip
absolutely
back to my optimistic side, which is that, I mean, in terms of absolute
Deprivation.
deprivation, a lot of neighborhoods and cities and people are better off. I mean, I can, there's a lot of
You're
statistics I
absolutely
could
right.
rattle off, right? Longevity is up, people are going to school longer, teen births are down, abortion is down, crime is down. A lot of good things are happening, and guess what? Inequality is shooting up. Now, I'm not saying inequality is causing those things, but what's happening is the quality of life, subsistence levels, the absolute deprivation, that has really improved. And you have inequality. So it's a
And
complicated
the Manhattan
scene.
and San Francisco housing markets are not the national
Yeah,
housing
and
markets.
so I think what we don't want to do is apply a left-right political frame to all this. You really have to take an analytic
so
frame,
by the way,
which makes it much more,
Yeah,
gray.
we agree, and Brandon has been working here on this specifically, that this process, especially in the middle of the country, has the potential to really change the political dynamic around immigration, and especially if you could tailor immigration policy somewhat to the different needs and opportunities and perceived benefits in different regions, we really might be able to unlock this huge bottleneck we've had.
And Brandon has made the case very eloquently for city-based visas, which I like, but that leads to one last question, which has gotten me in a lot of trouble. So I'm going to see if you guys want to get into trouble with it. To what degree do we address this issue by people-specific programs, increasing mobility, letting people adjust to where jobs are, versus place-specific subsidies, an attempt to build up places in decline? I once said that I thought, and I tried to be nuanced, I said that I thought people-related programs made more sense, and I got a barrage of hate that I'm still not recovered from. So I preface that by saying, what do you got? Because I think that's a really important question, and I don't think it's one or the other. To what degree do we allow people to try to adjust, or to what degree do we try to help those small places that are really stuck in a tough spot?
I think you want to be thoughtful about the costs of adjustment and sharing those costs, and be humane in thinking about that. But on the other hand, I think one of the huge advantages a country like the United States is going to have, and a country like China is going to have, and maybe India has if they get things arranged right, is the benefit of competition, not just between firms, but between locations. And that what will really drive better service provision of these essential services in cities is a active competition for residents. And so we don't want to go so far in these, place-based policies that we undercut what should be a very strong incentive to do a better job.
I just once got a really very productive lecture from one of my Asian students. At that time, this was many years ago, we were talking about industrial policy and the Japanese model and the Chobol in Korea, and he just said, Professor Florida, he was very kind, he said, you have this interjurisdictional competition. You have 50 states and 350 metros and thousands of cities constantly competing, and he said, that's probably a better way to solve problems than one policy. So I do think that that federalistic system creates advantages. And Rob, not to put you on the hot seat, but I know
Sure.
you probably thought about this more than just about
yeah,
anybody.
I have. To be honest, I don't know. And the reason is the evidence on both are problematic, right? And so not to cop out, but I think that scientifically that's the way I view it. I mean, I can look at people-based programs, and there's some good ones. My problem with the voucher-based programs, for example, though, is that it puts people in an untenable spot if they don't want to move. They have relatives, they have family nearby, babysitters, and so forth. And so the only way you're going to get improvement is if you have to move. Well, that's problematic. On the other hand, I think you can shift your definition of people-based, like instead of the moving to opportunity-like voucher program, a more generalized program where, I mean, it's impossible in today's political environment, but where everyone, let's say, just got a subsidy so they wouldn't have to move. But what that means to me is that you still also have to provide the safety and the infrastructure of those places. So I don't see how you can do it without place-based interventions. Now, how much you skew it and select and how many, I mean, the promise zones, I think, is a wonderful program, but it's very, very few. neighborhoods. So there's got to be a mix, but I would say we have to revise our notion of what a
And complicating
person-based
that, of course, is
approach
the what we talked about to begin with, the concentration of skills and capabilities, their clustering, the effects of that in certain spaces. But I think, Rob, you said this very, very nicely, that when people have to leave, I moved 20 some times since I left undergraduate school, and each time was pretty wrenching. And the first time leaving the community of family or friends was gut wrenching. And I think the research on that suggests that the psychic cost of these kind of relocations, in terms of anomie, isolation, alienation,
They're totally ignored.
They're totally ignored, and they're very high. And so it's a very difficult question. I think, what do you think? We're pretty close to our time is at an end. So I'd like to thank Paul and Rob. I think this has been incredibly beneficial. We don't often get to do this. Talk between three people who've studied something from a variety of perspectives, and I relished personally this kind of opportunity. I don't get to do this very often at all, or maybe this is the first time I've ever done it. Yeah. So I think it's very good we did it, but we should encourage more of it. And thanks to all of you for.
Well, and the best thing is if you learn something. So I had been telling this story about 6 ships with Jerry and had gotten nowhere on it. So you got to connect me with this guy who says he turned around the
I
ship.
see my wife, Rana. She'll have Mike. He's the guy who turned around the ship.
Okay.
So I had to tell you that. And thanks everybody, and thanks to everybody for help organizing this. It's been wonderful.